Okay, welcome back. We have Gina back with our second different section we're going to talk about. But I'm going to let Gina introduce herself a little bit more in this section.
Yeah, let's do that. So I'm Gina Battye. I use she, her pronouns. People often ask me how I got into what I'm doing now. So maybe if we start there, and then I'll talk to you very briefly about the kind of work that we're doing. So there were two experiences that I had early on in my career that led me to start thinking about psychological safety and workplace cultures, and that led me to start the Psychological Safety Institute. So let me tell you a little bit about those two experiences, and then we'll go from there. So my career began as a teacher, but not in the traditional way that you might expect. Imagine this, right? I'm 22 years old, 4'11" tall. Sadly, I haven't grown, I have to say. And I was working with dangerous criminals, my first job, right? So you can imagine, I'm working with criminals. The workplace was hostile. It was aggressive. It was a very nerve-wracking place to work. I was teaching people who had been involved in offences related to drugs, alcohol, violence, theft, sexual offences, that kind of stuff. From the very first day in my role, my protection, safety and well-being were taken very seriously by my employer because it had to be. It could have been a matter of life or death. Now, I talked about those two workplace experiences that led me to do what I do. So this is the first one. I was walking back to my car one winter's night. It was in 2004. It was raining. It was cold. You can imagine. It's the UK. You can definitely imagine now, right? So I was followed by a dangerous man, and it led to me being stalked for weeks. I wasn't able to go anywhere without a probation officer escorting me. Literally, like when I arrived at work in the morning, I'd be met by somebody in the car park. I'd be escorted into work. If I wanted to go out at any point in the day, somebody was always with me. And then when I left on a night for that walk home, again, somebody would walk me back to my car, make sure I was in it safely. I'd get off, I'd drive home, and then I'd ring the office to tell them I was home safe and sound. So that was a daily kind of occurrence for me. It was a bit odd at first, I have to say, but over time I got used to it because, it was the situation. Now, thankfully, my employers did create that work environment where I was physically, mentally, and psychologically safe. They put so much stuff in place to make sure that I was safe. Now, you can imagine, right? I was 22 at the time when all this started, quite young still. It was quite a scary experience to have that, but also working day in, day out with dangerous criminals. You can imagine it'll take a toll on somebody. So got to 2 years later and I thought, do you know what? I fancy a change. I'm going to try something a bit different. So I moved into teaching adults in the workplace for a college. So this time I was working for a college entity in the UK again. And instead of, when I talk about teaching in a college, people expect that I'm going into classrooms and teaching like kids, right? It wasn't that. So I would go out into people's workplaces. I'd go to them at their place of work and I would teach them where they were working. So that's what I did. It was such a contrast, though, to the work that I was doing previously. I didn't feel safe bringing my authentic self to work. I wasn't out in the workplace. So in the first episode, I talked a little bit about this. I wasn't out in the workplace at the time. From the very first day, I felt uncomfortable with my manager. She was one of these kind of people that was a dictator. She was controlling. She was manipulative. She lied. She abused her power, that kind of stuff. And I watched her bully my colleagues out of their roles. Now, sadly, I became her next target, and I experienced an intense period of bullying for being gay. I didn't want to report it at first because I didn't want to out myself to the leadership team and to my colleagues. I just didn't want to have that conversation with people. It was quite a toxic environment. Homophobia was rife in the whole institution. So I just didn't want to do it. But instead, I kept a log of incidents alongside loads of evidence. And it got to about a year later, I think it was, when I felt enough was enough. I was getting quite poorly from having to mask and hide and censor things. So I decided to report it. I'm often asked what was the result. Well, I want to say you wouldn't believe it, but you probably would actually. So my manager was actually promoted, and I was told not to progress the case any further because it would highlight my sexual orientation to colleagues. So I kept quiet, stayed there a little while longer, and then I decided to leave. I just couldn't be in that environment any longer. So I left. I set up my own business, and I've been running that now for the last 14 years. It's the Psychological Safety Institute. Thank you very much. And I'm the CEO and founder of that. So the Institute are global leaders in workplace psychological safety and workplace culture. And over the years, I've developed a lot of intellectual property around psychological safety, which you can find more about in my book. I talk through a lot of it in my book. So it's The Authentic Organisation. If you look behind Stephanie there, just there, you'll see it. Thanks for that. Our mission at the Institute is to create work environments where people thrive. That's it. That's what we want to do. And we want to challenge and transform workplace attitudes and outdated cultures. So that's a little bit about my background, how I got into what I do now. I hope that kind of lays the context for our conversations.
Absolutely. So we get a lot of followers that are leaders, HR folks, wanting to learn, whose role is it in psychological safety? So maybe we can start there, because that's always a big one of like, whose role is it? And it's, it always, from conversations I have is, people think, oh, it's the HR person's role. Oh, it's the manager's role or the CEO's role. But, let's tell them the bright news of whose role is it?
And it might hit the stop button in a minute.
Yeah,
doing that.
That's okay. That's okay.
Let's start there, right? So we're asked at the Institute all the time, whose responsibility is it? And like you said, often people say it's the leader's responsibility, or it's HR, or, it might be the ED&I team, for instance. Now, let me dispel that. Okay, that's a mistake, right? It's not any one person's responsibility within the organisation. It's a collaborative effort. Every single person within an organisation plays a crucial role in creating a workplace where everyone can not just survive, but thrive, because that's what we want, right? We want people to thrive in their workplace. So it doesn't matter what role you're in, what level of seniority you're at, that doesn't matter. Every single person in the organisation has a role to play. And that's from bringing your authentic self to work, through to practicing effective communication, through to navigating different team dynamics and personalities, to creating safe spaces and actively participating. It requires commitment and effort from everyone. Now, that being said, there are specific responsibilities for different groups of people within the organisation. So everybody has that responsibility that I just talked about. However, if you're a leader, you've also got 3 other primary areas of responsibilities. So the first is the task of developing and communicating a clear mission and set of values that prioritise psychological safety. Okay, so that's the first. The second is championing psychological safety as loudly as possible. Now, that includes ensuring the narrative of psychological safety is disseminated throughout the entire organisation, the correct definition of psychological safety, I should say, and integrated into every aspect of working life. So that might be discussions in leadership meetings, it might be team meetings, it might be one-on-one meetings. You've also got to make sure that you're ensuring maximum attendance at training events and organisational-wide completion of any psychological safety annual assessments that you do. So that's the second. The third one is it's important that you lead the way in cultivating a culture characterised by effective communication, mutual respect, and collaboration. You've got to think about those diverse perspectives within your organisation, making sure that they're all valued and that all employees are treated with dignity and respect. Now, as I say that, people often say, well, isn't that the responsibility of everyone? Yes, it is, right? But leaders have got a specific role to play there to be role models for that. So that's why I say that's quite an important thing. Managers and the HR team have got different areas of responsibility. Do you want me to go through those now? Would that be helpful?
Yeah, for sure. Let's do it.
Yeah, okay, right. So managers then have got 5 different areas of responsibilities. Sorry, you've got a few more. Now, firstly, you're expected to lead by example and model the behaviour that you expect from your team members. I think that one's kind of self-explanatory, really. The second one is you should encourage open communication and active listening within your teams. So the idea there is that you're starting to create a safe space for individuals and starting to build trust. The third is around providing feedback and support to your team members to help them to grow and thrive in the organisation. The fourth is you play a pivotal role in championing diversity and inclusion. And that's manifested through hiring and promotion practices. It's about recognizing the value and importance of individuals with different backgrounds, skill sets, and experiences. Okay. And then lastly, you are responsible for addressing any incidents of conflict or harassment promptly and taking a strong stance against those behaviors. Now, hopefully when I say those 5 things, they're not like a revelation to you. You already know them, Steve. But they do play a big part in creating a psychologically safe environment. Right, let's touch upon HR. So again, I think you've got a few more than 5. I can't remember how many, but let me outline the key responsibilities that you've got. So first one is establishing policies and procedures that support psychological safety, inclusion, and equity. You must provide adequate resources and training to support individuals as well as teams. You're responsible for ensuring everybody's got access to confidential resources for support. So things like, so we call them employee assistance programs. Do you call them the same thing? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So those kind of programs or counselling services, anything like that that give confidential resources for support are really important. You're responsible for monitoring and addressing any issues related to discrimination, harassment, or bullying in the workplace, and they need to be dealt with promptly and effectively. You're also tasked with measuring and monitoring psychological safety, and then taking action to address any concerns or issues that are being flagged up from people. You need to continuously evaluate and improve upon the workplace culture. Don't just take it for granted that that's your culture. Work on it, actively work on it, listen to what people are saying and do something about it. You want to create a safe, inclusive and supportive environment for all employees to enable them to thrive. Now, last point, it's vital to note that some of these responsibilities are not exclusive to those specific groups of people that I've said. Other members of the organisations do play an active role in these efforts, but you've got to remember that every single person has got a responsibility to create a psychologically safe environment for yourself personally, and then extending that out to individuals you interact with, through to teams, through to interdepartmental relationships. Okay, everybody's got a role to play. But sadly, those 3 groups have got extra things that they need to think about. Sorry about that.
But it's important, I think, people have an understanding within organizations of what that looks like, because I know from coming from different healthcare roles that we're not always trained as managers and leaders. What is our responsibility? So sometimes we struggle with that. So I'm sure you're asked this question a lot. How do I know if my organization is psychologically safe? Can you give us some flags that might exist if there may not be psychological safety in the organization or there's trouble coming?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many different things that you can look out for. So I'll give you a bit of a flavour of a few of them. Now, when I do this, I'm not going to focus on interpersonal risk-taking and making mistakes. Like, people don't feel safe to make mistakes. I'm not going to touch that because psychological safety is a much bigger concept than that. So when I talk about red flags, we're talking about things like individuals aren't bringing their authentic self to work. Okay, so they're hiding elements of themselves, they've got the barriers up with colleagues. You'll see that. You'll see that individuals are struggling to manage their emotions in interactions with colleagues, which then impacts on their behaviour in the workplace. You might find that individuals are triggered by certain people or conversations. You might feel frustration from people that they don't discuss. So instead, what you'll find is people tend to bottle up their frustration, they take it home, they let it fester, then they come back the next day and it's worse than it was when they left. You'll kind of feel that going on. You'll notice that there is a distinct lack of personal information sharing between individuals. You might notice negative behaviours in the workplace. You'll notice that individuals meet the minimum requirements and then clock off exactly on time. Like, not even 1 minute over. They won't stay. They'll just be off. They'll be like, no, I'm done. My pen is down. I'm leaving. That kind of thing, right? Another big one is about participation. So participation is passive. So this is where individuals stay quiet and they don't actively participate in either meetings, discussions, whatever it might be. You might notice that as people asking a question and then having those awkward silences where people are like, nope, I'm not going to answer. I'm not saying a thing. There might be an unwillingness or a reluctance to switch cameras or microphones on unless you prompt them. Let's talk about personality types, because that's quite a big one. So individuals find it challenging to navigate diverse personality types in the team. So that tends to have an impact on communication and morale. You'll probably hear discussions about or experience strained team relationships. There might be disengagement among team members. There might be a lack of trust. You might see that as consistent misunderstandings or misinterpretation of messages. You'll see confusion. You'll experience conflicts. People don't express their expectations clearly enough, which then can result in more frustration, more conflict. What else might you find? People are excluding each other with their choice of language. Messages might be overcomplicated. People are not understanding properly. Individuals might not contribute to team goals, objectives, or projects. For instance, they might not want to collaborate. They might make errors and not want to discuss them. They might shy away from any sort of creativity or innovation kind of things. And then lastly, let's take it a bit bigger. So micromanagement is rife. That's kind of a big one. A culture of blame is widespread. We tend to find that training is conducted on like an ad hoc basis where it's literally just to check a box, which is very frustrating from our point of view, I have to say. You might experience high rates of absenteeism, presenteeism. You might notice a steady or a large flow of people just leaving without telling you why. And then lastly, you might not even have a clue about psychological safety, right? So you might not know it exists. You might not know that it doesn't exist. You might not measure it. But all of those pointers that I've just said will indicate that you have got low levels of psychological safety. People don't feel safe at work. And when people don't feel safe at work, they don't thrive. And when they don't thrive, your organization doesn't thrive because people are not being creative, innovative, collaborating well, having conversations that are effective, that kind of stuff. So all of those things indicate that you've got an issue. And if you're listening to that and going, yep, we've got that, that, then I suggest that you do something about it quite quickly.
Absolutely. People, and I know we've had discussion online about which comes first, right? Is it psychological safety or inclusion? And, we're in agreement that, you got to have the psychological safety piece, in order for the inclusion piece to come with it, right? Like it's kind of those two things that kind of come together, but, to create, I think, a great workplace environment. But like without the psychological safety, the inclusion piece, it doesn't really flow well. Can you expand on that a little bit?
I'd love to, actually, because that's one of the... So we experienced three big misconceptions within the Institute that we spend a lot of our time unpicking. And the second one, I've already talked about the first, which was the speak-up culture. The second one is that it's about people believing that psychological safety and inclusion are either the same thing or they're intrinsically linked. So let me talk to you a little bit about that, because they're not the same thing. There's a misconception that they always go hand in hand, and it stems from that misunderstanding about what psychological safety actually is. So the reason that people think that is because they think that psychological safety is about a speak-up culture and that they believe it's about interpersonal risk-taking. But that's not what it is, as we've already discussed in the previous conversation that we had. It is entirely possible, right, for someone to feel psychologically safe without feeling fully integrated into their team. That is a possibility. But let's ask ourselves that question. Can inclusion truly exist without a foundation of psychological safety? So let me give you an example, right? Imagine you've got an employee who feels comfortable sharing their ideas and they communicate well, but they often find their contributions are overlooked. Okay? They might also feel excluded from social gatherings outside work, even though they feel comfortable. Okay? That situation shows that while they feel safe expressing themselves, they don't feel completely included in team dynamics. On the other hand, let's consider another scenario where an employee is invited to team activities. Okay? They feel valued, yet they perceive the workplace as competitive and judgmental. So what happens? They don't bring all of their authentic self into the workplace because they are worried about negative consequences of people finding out certain things about them. True inclusion goes beyond participation. Okay? It involves feeling a deep sense of belonging and acceptance within a team or an organization. Without psychological safety, individuals may hold back from fully engaging, which undermines their sense of this genuine inclusion, okay? So inclusion alone doesn't ensure psychological safety. When we talk about psychological safety and inclusion, we tend to kind of look at the hierarchy of psychological safety to highlight where they both sit, right? So there's 8 different levels in the hierarchy of psychological safety. The first 5 are internal responsibilities within an organization. So when we talk about psychological safety, those 5 levels are really important. Okay, so we've got the first level is it's about you, personal safety. It's about you feeling safe within yourself. The second level of that is one-to-one safety. So you feel safe having a one-on-one conversation with somebody else. The third level is team safety. So that's you feeling safe having a conversation, not just with one person, but with a group of people now. The fourth level is around collaboration safety. So we're extending beyond you personally to a one-to-one conversation, now to a team level conversation. Now we're progressing on to collaboration safety. So you're putting all of that together to go, I'm going to collaborate with a group of people. This is how I feel safe. This is what I need in place for me to feel safe to do that. So that's level 4. Level 5 is organizational level safety. So that is the point where you start bringing in policies and procedures. We're looking at leadership practices, much wider kind of organizational level stuff. So you need to have all 5 of those levels in place, starting from level 1 and working the way up to have psychological safety within the organization. So where does inclusion fit in? Well, inclusion fits in at level 5, that very top level. That's where you start to see inclusion. So if people are focusing their attentions just on inclusion, that's where you're focusing, top level, level 5. You need to be starting at level 1, personal safety, and then working your way up. Once you get to level 5, inclusion kind of naturally happens anyway. It's part of all of that conversation that we've just had. So yeah, when people talk about inclusion, there is this misconception that psychological safety and inclusion are intrinsically linked or they're the same thing. They're not. They're very, very different, very separate concepts. Psychological safety starts with the individual. Inclusion tends to kind of start fitting in when it all comes together towards that organizational level.
Right. Are there any tidbits before we clue up, any tidbits of information that we haven't covered on that you'd like to expand on?
What?
I know there's a lot. I mean, there's so many conversations.
Out of all the questions that you've asked, that's like my
apologies.
So, wow, let's see. I'm thinking what would be most useful for people right now. Okay, so let's think about that. Maybe we touch upon things that people can do. What are the kind of things that individual leaders can take right now to create some good conditions? Maybe we start there.
Absolutely.
All right. Okay, let me think about that then. So I guess the first thing is you've got to start with yourself. I say this to everybody, right? It all starts within, okay? So as a leader, I would be expecting you to be reflecting regularly on you. So what's going on with your thoughts, your emotions, and how is that impacting on your performance and behavior in the workplace? I would always start there, okay? So that would be my starting point with any leader that I was working with. Once you've started to raise your own awareness and you've started to get that intrapersonal awareness, you're starting to understand yourself a little bit better. That's when you can start looking at the outside elements. So you start then thinking about, how do I communicate? Am I communicating effectively with individuals, firstly? There's different aspects to communication. There's the whole, what I'm putting out there, so how I'm putting a message across to people. Am I getting it across in the way that I'm intending? Are they hearing it right? The other aspect to it is the receiving element. So somebody's giving you a message. Are you hearing it right? Are you putting it through any filters? Are you questioning what you're hearing? So that's the second bit. The third bit is the interchange, that conversational element. And this is the bit where a lot of people fall down. So we don't tend to learn these skills, right? We don't have it in our educational system to learn the soft skills of communication. So often we find that leaders are falling down with, how do I deal with conflict in an effective way? How do I deal with microaggressions or misunderstandings within the team? How do we make sure that we're expressing our expectations clearly enough within the team and within the organization? So I would start with then, after you've done the whole intrapersonal stuff, how am I communicating? Am I getting my message across in the correct way? Are people hearing it correctly? Am I hearing things correctly? And when I'm in dialogue with people, am I making the most of that situation? Is it clear? Is it concise? Those kind of questions. So I would always start with those kind of two things. The third thing that I would then look at is the teams that you're working with. Do they understand each other? And are you getting the most out of those teams? So you might want to start by asking questions such as, what are the different personalities within the team? And how do we work with those different personalities to get the most out of that group of people? What are people's personal boundaries, work boundaries? What are their communication preferences, their work preferences? What are their celebration preferences even, right? Really understanding the individuals within that team. Not just you as an individual, but you all need to understand each other, because when you understand each other, that's when you start to work well together. So it's having that discussion as a team. How can we leverage what we've got here? How can we navigate all these different preferences and personalities and all this other good stuff that's going on in the mix? How do we navigate that? And then how do we leverage that? So that would be a big conversation that I'd be having. And then the last thing that I'd suggest is, remember, you're a role model. People are looking at you every day, whether you know it or not. Everything that you write, everything that you put out there, everything that you are, everything that people see of you, you are a role model. So just remember that, okay? And think about, how can I put myself out there in the way that is authentic, that shows that I am the leader that I want to be, not the leader that I currently am. Okay, because there might be a discrepancy between those two, right?
For sure.
And how do I make sure that I'm getting the right message across to people in terms of who I am and how I want to show up? Because it's like, when you throw a pebble in a pond, it's like that ripple effect, right? If you show up as you want to show up and you are putting yourself out there in the most authentic way, people see that, they feel it, they experience it. And that rubs off on people, and they look at you and go, that's interesting. So they feel confident to do this and comfortable and safe to do these things. Why don't I feel that? And that starts that internal dialogue for other people to start thinking, that's interesting. So if they feel like that, why don't I feel like that? What's going on within me? How can I get to that point? It starts that kind of dialogue internally within people. So being a role model is absolutely huge. Remember that you're always on show. Somebody
Isn't
said
that true?
to me
Isn't that true?
Yeah. Somebody said that to me once. So I was like, well, always? Like, always? Oh, that's a bit scary, but okay, I'll take that.
I love this conversation so much, Gina, because I think it's almost like that positivity that you put out in the world comes back, that positivity piece. Right. So I think reminding us and I say to people, you may not have a CEO next to your name, or you may not be in a leadership position, but we are all leaders in our own right. And kind of trying to look at, how do we all be the change that we want to be and we want to see in this world? And I think we all have steps that we can take to kind of embrace the positivities and just making our workplaces more psychologically safe, more inclusive, that place that we all want to belong and thrive. I think that's the word for today to take away, thriving. How do we make workplaces thrive?
Absolutely. And we've all got a role to play in that. It doesn't come back to any one person in the organization. If you want to work in an environment where you can thrive, but also where everybody else can thrive around you, where it's inclusive, where it's healthy, where you want to go to work every day, right? If you want that environment, you've got to start creating it. Don't let everybody else do the legwork. You are responsible for it too. So, be that role model, show up, do the work.
100%. And of course, we know that it's not as easy as that. It does take a lot of grind. It takes a lot of steps. But I think if you have workplaces that are fully committed to this, I think that it happens, and it can happen. I've seen it happen in organizations. And I've seen it not happen in organizations, but it's all about the roles that people want to play. This is fantastic. Any closing words for today?
Good question. I guess it's just remembering that you, as I've already mentioned a few times, you are responsible. You need to show up. You need to do the work. Yes, it isn't easy. We know that. But the one starting point would be looking at yourself and thinking, how can I show up more of my authentic self in my workplace with my colleagues? And it might just be with one person in the next week. What is the one thing that I can bring to a conversation with somebody that I already feel comfortable with to be more of my authentic self? And then once you start doing that with that person, you might identify more people or more situations. So it's about being courageous. Okay. I always talk about, I think I use this thing. It's gone out of my head now. Oh my God, that's really annoying. Like 10 seconds of courage, right? So it literally takes like a few moments of having the courage to say something. And as soon as you say it, then you're like, oh, okay, I feel better now. It's like anything. Courage comes, but you've got to take that first step. Okay. And you're the one that's responsible for that. So I hope this conversation's been helpful. Hope we've given you lots of information that's useful. But if you do have any questions, you know where you can find me. You know where you can find Stephanie as well. So please do feel free to reach out to us.
Perfect. So you're a big voice on LinkedIn. So if folks want to connect in, LinkedIn would be the best place to connect in with you.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. And I look forward to it.
Amazing. Thank you so much for today's brilliant conversation. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for having me on, and we'll hopefully speak soon.
Absolutely.